Thank you very much for helping me out technically. Now I hope you don't expect too elaborated slides. They're quite simple, but since my presentation will be rather abstract, I thought it might be helpful to have some slides. Yeah, I have a difficult task because the first part of my speech has been discussed before. It will be not a definition, but a characterization, the development of a type of populism. And the second part of my speech, the impact the rule of law has on democracy and why populism is a threat to the rule of law, has been discussed in the subsequent discussion we had before lunch. So maybe I have the chance to really focus on my thesis, which from the point of view of legal philosophy will be that populism is a form of political communication that tries to achieve its goals by breaking up the dialectical connection between democracy and the rule of law, or if you prefer, the principle of the legal state. So here we heard this morning Yves Meny speak of a bricolage between democracy and the rule of law. I will specify this bricolage a little bit and call it a dialectical relationship. This dialectics is not a negative dialectics, but a positive dialectics. I think that the rule of law and democracy are mutually dependent because they both are necessary for the realization of political freedom. So the inner contradictions, but contradictions in a Hegelian sense, will be institutionalized by the two principles of democracy and the rule of law, which are mutually dependent. And exactly this dependency is what populism aims at, or what it threatens. So first of all, let me mention, because this was also discussed previously, I have a critical concept of populism. I'm aware of the fact that, for example, Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, was very popular. But this is to be distinguished from populism, as will be clear in a moment. If you look at the trial against, since we were very focused this morning on Europe and North America, I may add some South American examples. If you look at the trial against Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, in Curitiba, then you see how a popular, extremely popular political figure, a former president of Brazil, acts and respecting the authority of the court, encouraging the very populist judge, Muro, to adhere to the rule of law. And if you contrast this with his successor, Jair Bolsonaro, then you see pretty much the difference between popular and populist. So when I characterize populism, I'm not going to give a definition. And please don't take what I was saying in my thesis as a definition, but rather as an ideal type, a type of populism which consists of many elements. Some of them may be missing in some forms of populism, whereas others are there, which again will be missing in the first forms. So I'm going to focus on two aspects of populism. One is a procedural, the second one is a structural aspect. So if we speak of procedural characteristics or aspects of populism, the first one is, in a Hegelian sense, what we could call immediacy. populism can be characterized by primordial, non-discursive convictions. Among them may be ideology. Now, I'm very familiar with the fact, and we have discussed this also, and Chantal Mouffe has just mentioned this, that we cannot identify populism with ideology, be it thin or thick ideology. But it is quite clear that they work with ideologies, that they instrumentalize ideologies. Ideologies with respect to morals. In philosophical terms, we can speak of a strong cognitivism. Populists and some of their followers know what is justice, know what is good. They consider, populist leaders consider themselves as the sole representatives of such a decent morality. They know what truth is. They know that, some of them, know that there is no climate change. They deny the impact of scientific findings and proclaim truth counterfactually. Then another aspect, other aspects could be strong identities. People are considered in a spatial way as natural entities or historically formed entities. A wonderful expression was used by Richard Nixon in his Vietnamization speech when he spoke of a silent majority. The people as the true people as a silent majority. A silent majority is one that is either hindered or does not articulate itself. So it does not enter into a political discourse. And all these elements are elements that you find in other parties as well, but not in the same assembly of elements. A direct expression of the political will, direct communication, or rather direct speech to the voters. Twitter seems to be the political means of communication for populists, but hardly they communicate with their voters. They claim to have a direct mandate from the people, often a mandate that in fact they give themselves. They refer to the spirit of the people, the Volksgeist, but not to actual discourses. So here again, this spirit of the people is a structure of the people that is already existent and has only to be discovered. Other aspects, procedural aspects of populism, are their relation to media. They don't consider what's in the name of media as an intermediary means of political communication, but they instrumentalize media. Now, this is not so problematic because during election campaigns, everybody tries to instrumentalize the media. But it makes clear that if such a party is not ready to accept a certain equality in the use of media after being elected, that the political function of the media will be threatened. They promote collectivist, especially right-wing populist and spatial concept of the people. They privatize the public discourse, and this goes to the core of populism. They privatize the public discourses through the affirmation of preconceived opinions. We have already spoken about bots, filter bubbles, and other technical means, which are not means for an open discussion of interest, but for the confirmation of pre-existing fears of the people. Now, again, nothing is to be said against plebiscitarian forms of immediate democracy. But it can be abused, and populists, think of Orban in the migration situation, they tend to abuse the means of direct democracy. And also non-institutional forms of communication. Leaders claiming to have direct mandates from a people that they themselves construct. I fully agree that the idea of the people is a construction. The question is who constructs these people? And in populism, often it seems to be, and again take Orban, that he's the one who constructs the people. Activism overcomes rhythm. If you look at parliamentary periods and well-designed re-election possibilities by the constitutions, populists, be them left-wing or right-wing, tend to overcome these limitations because they are representatives of true opinions. Exclusivity, we have been speaking about this before, the we-they distinction. Erdogan, for example, used this extensively, but also Bolsonaro in Brazil. If you looked at the campaign in which Bolsonaro was finally elected, the Brazilian flag, which you may have seen, even as a German, I may say this, during the World Cup in soccer, used by all Brazilians. Now, in the campaign, this Brazilian flag was used by only a party pretending that they represent the true Brazilian people. So the members of the PT had only red flags, which you won't find in the Brazilian national flag. So misuse of national symbols expressing or symbolizing that they take them for the whole people. Xenophobia is the result of preconceived convictions, strong identity by convictions. The leader is supposed to be the incarnation of the supposed will of the people. And also from this preconceived, primordial political convictions results a strong dualism, a Machiavellian or Schmittian dualism of good and evil, citizens and strangers, friends and foes, subjects and rulers. We, establishment, although some of the populists stem from the establishment, some of them pretend to be part of what we could consider as we of the anti-establishment. I'm skipping this as soon as they are in office. They negate, put their political energy, their political criticism against existing constitutions. We have spoken about the struggle of peace against the separation of powers, especially against the hated independence of the judiciary. They criticize the limitation of power by individual rights and the formal structures and processes of the rule of law. And finally, this has been mentioned before, they motivate their followers by fear and not what is at the core of the principle of the rule of law, by legal security, the security of the mind. This does not mean that they are anti-institutional. Especially during the campaigning, they criticize the institutions for being unfair, but as soon as they have entered power, that they have seized governments, they seize the existing institutions and transform them so that their activism can go on. Courts are being criticized. They are hindrances, there are obstacles of the free will formation of the people. Orban was lamenting about the extreme workload of the very successful Hungarian Constitutional Court. What did he do after entering office? He extended the number of judges. He doubled them. And guess who were the new judges? Where did they come from? Fidesz. Also think of the poor. Polish judges who have to spend so much of their lifetime in the courts, retire them early, bring some new forces into the court. I think these are quite speaking examples of how populists, as soon as they enter into power, transform the political and legal institution. Now, if we look at constitutional democracy and populism, as I was claiming in my thesis, that constitutional democracy is a dialectical unity of institutional and procedural structures based on freedom. This means that democracy needs the law, just as the law needs democracy to realize freedom. And as we have seen in the characterization of populism, both in the procedural aspects, as well as in the structural aspects, they are targeted, they are aiming, they are threatening this unity of democracy and the rule of law. Let's look a little closer to aspects of democracy. I'm not going to go into this very far. First of all, the democratic principle. The subject of course, democracy has to do with participation. Democratic participation is equal participation. The equals are the individual citizens or the associations. Being identities such as the people, as the unity of individual citizens that are not pre-existent, but they are social constructions. And since they are social constructions, everybody who is affected by being a member of a people or not being a member of a people should have the chance to participate in the construction, not only of the individual self, but also of the associations he belongs to, including the people themselves. Now, the result of this democratic participation is public deliberation, not private deliberation. I think it is the achievement of modern liberal democracies, which constitutional democracy are part of, a group of liberal democracies, that the private interests of individual systems through a transparent and open public discourse is transformed into public reasons for political decisions, thereby not only offering legitimacy, but legitimation of politics. An economically well-informed policy could have legitimacy, but it would never have legitimation by the democratic process procedures. Now, what is the function of the rule of law for democracy? A functioning production of reasons for good political decisions requires individual rights, requires the freedom of speech. That doesn't mean that it should not be balanced in certain cases of hate speech with the rights of personality and other rights. It requires a true freedom of the press. A true freedom of the press is not only a freedom from public, from state, from government intervention, but it is also a freedom from economic domination. So this right of the freedom of the press imposes an obligation on the state to guarantee a pluralistic media landscape, because only a pluralistic media landscape is capable of producing good reasons for good political decisions. And one, like in Brazil again, that is dominated by a few media companies, is not capable of doing so. And of course, the freedom of association has to be protected. Only then can entities, social entities, be formed like the people as a result of mutual recognition processes. The basis is the mutual recognition of individual citizens with reasonable co-citizens in political dialogues. Not the confirmation of your anxieties, of your fears in a filter bubble, but in open and transparent discourses. Only then the people forms itself in the deliberative and democratic procedure as a competition of the conceptions of the people. And also common values, which I think we need in a constitutional democracy, are formed this way. Now, about structures, I have pointing at the importance of free system and free and pluralistic system of media before. This is what system of checks and balances provides for democracy. Independent courts that are really capable of securing our individual rights to communication, to association, to demonstration, and so on. And the protection of minorities. If you look, we all heard of the fires in the Amazon forest earlier this year. This had a major effect on indigenous people, of course, living in these rainforests. But the populist ideology, anti-universalist ideology of Bolsonaro, claiming that the rainforest is our forest and we are the people who can decide about this rainforest, and we are the white people from southeastern Brazil, has led to cruel effects on the indigenous minorities up in the rainforest. I think this is quite obvious how populists have problematic effects on minorities, and why a protection of the minorities by human rights, by independent international and national courts, and the Brazilian Constitutional Court has played an important role here, is in place. Now, given these characterizations, these threats to both democracy and the rule of law, I didn't explain the dialectical, 5 minutes, do I have 5 minutes? The dialectical unity of the two of them. Because what was mentioned before as a bricolage or as a contradiction between the static principle of the rule of law and the dynamic principle of democracy is quite obvious. But there is a mediation of the two principles possible. And this mediation comes to the common principle of freedom. So different from what Jürgen Habermas has claimed, that there is an equal originality of the rule of law and democracy, I would claim that that both have the same origin. And this same origin is freedom. Freedom as negative freedom, which is mostly protected by the rule of law or the Rechtsstaat, the principle of the legal state. Positive freedom as self-determination especially by laws, namely autonomy, is what is ultimately realized by the democratic principle. But this positive freedom can only be realized if there are possibility to withdraw from the public, to develop one's personality, one's ideas, and then communicate and collectively determine oneself and, the political process. So from this concept of freedom, this dialectical concept of freedom, stems a right to active participation in political decision. It does not yet mean a right to equal participation, because in some cases people may be more affected by democratic decisions than others. So there should be spaces, there should be groups of decisions in which the people concerned have more impact than others. So there should be rooms for unequal decisions. But the major decisions in a constitution, of course, need a democratic equal legitimation and participation. And this affects both the structure of democracy and the rule of law. Law itself is not a mere means of power. Law itself is an expression of freedom. Law itself is directed at protecting freedom. And the interpretation of this should be led by free participation of the people in the interpretation of the laws. It has been asked, should we discuss these principles of freedom, of dignity that's behind this freedom, and of equality? Should we discuss these with populists? Or should we acknowledge that they have a different opinion about this and stop the dialogue with them? I think this would be wrong. We should make clear that any dialogue, any discussion requires the acknowledgement of the other as a potentially free person and as an equal participant in a discussion. So we can't have reasonable discussions without accepting these values. And I think this could be made clear even to extreme right-wing populists. So to sum up, I would say that populism is not a challenge to either democracy or the rule of law or legal state, but to their dialectical unity as it is expressed in the concept of deliberative democracy or constitutional democracy. Certainly, in history, we have had democracies without the rule of law. We have had the systems of the legal state, coming from Germany or Austria, this is quite evident, in which you had the legal state but no democracy. But it is also just as certain that both principles would lose if we opened up the necessary connection of the two. Its necessity comes from the concept of liberty, the concept of freedom. Both principle of the rule of law and the principle of the legal state serve freedom. And if we open up this unity, if we threat this unity like the populists do, we do not give more democracy, but we threaten our political freedom. Thank you very much for your attention.